Where do people get this strength of will to stand against evil in its various manifestations? Well, God gives that.
And welcome to the Chinook Podcast. It is our delight to have you all here with us again today. My name is Brad Donovan. I'm here with Jamie Souls.
Hello.
And Pastor Nathan Zechfeld.
Hey there.
And we're coming to you from the basement of the church out in Grand Prairie, Alberta. So,
we've got ourselves a little nook in here that we hide away in and podcast.
We have our little nook for the Chinook and the
Chinook. Yeah.
And the weather outside is Chinookish.
Yeah. And we call people internationally because we've called people in the States and Canada and the UK.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of these days we'll get somebody from Asia and somebody from South America.
Yeah, well,
that'd be fun.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
That'd be awesome.
Another guy from Africa. That's the other continent.
Well, I know some guys from Brazil that we could interview.
Do you speak Portuguese?
I don't, but they speak English. I'm pretty sure.
Perfect.
There we go.
So should we? Let's
book review.
Let's book review. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start off. I have a book in my hand that I may have recommended before, but it's really worth recommending again. This is Faith by Rich Lusk, a primer on the mystery of infant salvation and a handbook for covenant parents. Faith lays out the scriptural case for why Christian parents should they should trust that their children are being given the promises of God and that the children are responding in faith. And it's just a really good, it's a good book, and it really does lay a good foundation underneath all those questions wrapped around Paedocommunion. Because if that child has faith and they're acting in accordance with faith, that negates the prohibition against him coming to the table.
Yeah, especially if we take a reductionistic view of faith.
Yes.
It is nothing more than mere mental assent to a doctrinal proposition.
Right.
If that's all faith ever is, then children, the aged, and the
mentally
ill
disabled
or disabled can't.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, you've cut out like.
Is there one of the confessional documents that the Reformed folk use that treat faith like that?
No.
I can't think of any. I was digging through the three forms, trying to find places where it laid out faith in terms of mental assent.
Well,
but it didn't do so, I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's described as confidence and knowledge in the Heidelberg Catechism.
Yeah, that's the one I'm more familiar with.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got the kids in the catechism class memorizing that one for a test for tomorrow. Question.
That's
number
good.
one.
That's good.
Good.
All right, I've got one to quickly recommend. Rich Lusk writes a catechism called "I Belong to God: A Catechism for Covenant Children." It's a small little booklet that is. I think it's pretty clear that he draws on historic Reformed catechisms like the Heidelberg and the Westminster, and basically the book is teaching children through memory and through question and answer what it means to be a child of the covenant, what it means to belong to God, and what it means to come to faith in Christ.
Excellent.
Right.
So we're on a Lusk trip here. There's a theme.
Yeah, we're going to have an interview here in a moment.
Yes, my heart has found a ready theme. But, okay, I'm going to break with tradition this morning. I am recommending a trio of books, a trilogy, by a fellow named Rick Atkinson. The first one is called An Army at Dawn, the second, The Day of Battle, and the third, The Guns at Last Light. It's a narrative account of the American Army in the Second World War in the European theater, beginning with the invasion of North Africa and their very nearly botched invasion of French North Africa. It is a very interesting read. He not only follows the main players, like, the generals, but he also includes a lot of anecdotal story from guys that experience various things at ground level. So it's a very well written. It's at some points he very nearly soars to poetry, and it's a marvelous story. I've read this story from the perspective of the British before, especially in Winston Churchill's memoirs. So now it's interesting to read the American experience of these events.
Oh, great! And what are those called?
An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and the Guns at Last Light by Rick Atkinson.
Rick Atkinson.
Sounds fun.
Oh, it is. It's great.
Awesome.
I'm in the middle of the Italian campaign right now. So today's episode is an interview episode where we're going to be calling not this Atkinson fellow, but that Rich Lusk fellow.
Rich Lusk.
Yes.
Hey, I wonder if we should call him and say, "Hey, Rich, you got a minute?"
Yeah, got a minute podcast.
Terrible.
All right, let's give him a ring.
Let's do this.
Alrighty.
I think we need Jeopardy music for this.
Hello.
Hey, Rich. This is Nathan Zeckfeld calling through the Chinook podcast.
Great to hear from you, Nathan.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're all doing good here. We've
All
got
right.
Jamie and Brad here as well.
Right. Hey, Rich. Jamie Souls here.
Great. Hey, Jamie. How are you?
I'm well.
Yeah, and I'm Brad Donovan. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brett.
So, should I get started, Nathan, or do you want?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we're more of a freewheeling kind of a conversational podcast here. So
Sure, that's great.
I first encountered your name in connection with the Auburn Avenue controversy way back. And so what I was wondering is, because you've been ministering for a very long time, would you be willing to maybe just give a short little 5 minutes or whatever on where you're from, what your route into the ministry was, and who you are, so our listeners kind of get a handle of you?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I was raised in a Christian home. So by the grace of God, I had a very faithful upbringing. We moved around quite a bit growing up, and we were in different kinds of churches. Obviously all conservative, evangelical, faithful churches of one form or another. But I wouldn't really say my family was certainly not Reformed theologically. Spent the longest period of my growing up years in Chicago, the Chicago area. And we went to I would basically call it a semi-reformed, semi-liturgical, congregational type church. But, there were not very many churches around, so it drew in a lot of different kinds of evangelical Christians, all the way from sort of your more hardcore Reformed types to charismatics, kind of all thrown into a church together. And that was a really interesting experience. I would say probably the predominant preaching voice, just to give you an idea of how things were when I grew up, probably the predominant preaching voice was John MacArthur. That's who my parents would have listened to. That's who I heard preaching. So like when I thought of preaching, that's who I thought of, was John MacArthur. Towards the end of my high school years, got more interested in theology and reading the Bible really regularly and asking a lot of questions. Actually picked up a few books before I left for college. So my family was still in Chicago. They ended up moving down to Alabama. Both my parents were from the South and had intended to come back to the South. So I was headed to the South for college. So I was going to Auburn, which is here in the state of Alabama. And I remember going to the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School bookstore, because that was not too far from where I lived. And I just wanted to grab some books to read to take with me as I was, packing everything up. And I ended up grabbing, I can actually still remember it. They had on the end cap of one of the book aisles, they had sort of like a red pill, blue pill kind of thing. They had the red book and the blue book. They had Zane Hodges' Absolutely Free, and they had John MacArthur's The Gospel According to Jesus. And of course, I knew to grab the red one, so I got the red pill book. It was very. I mean, I know that MacArthur eventually revised quite a bit of what he said in that book, and I think that it, obviously improved his theology in various ways. But the book was a real eye opener to me, because the one thing it drove home was the necessity of obedience. That there's no salvation without repentance. There's no salvation without a transformed life, and it made that point very clear. I also picked up A.W. Pink's The Sovereignty of God, because that sounded interesting to me, and I'd had a little bit of exposure to Calvinism, but I needed to learn more. And then I picked up Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, because I'd heard my pastor cite him before. And so I read those 3 books. I read the footnotes, and then kind of one thing led to another. I mean, next thing I knew, I was reading Lorraine Bettner's Reformed Doctrine of Predestination, and it wasn't long before I had I'd gotten to know a guy who was also very interested in Reformed theology, and we were reading all these books together, kind of R.C. Sproul type books, a lot of popularizations of Calvinism and that kind of thing. And he said, he's like, we're reading all this stuff about Luther and Calvin. Why don't we just read Luther and Calvin? And I was like, I guess you can't do that. So I started reading Luther, and then I read Calvin, and so I was still in college at this point, and I read the Institute, and when I got to book 4, I was tracking with everything really, really well. And when I got to book 4, I realized that Calvin was saying a lot of things about the church, and then particularly about the sacraments, that were very different than anything that I heard from the Reformed pastors that I had been around.
Yeah.
And that really intrigued me, and that kind of sent me down a certain path of wanting to investigate these things further. What's happened? What Calvin says seems to line up really well with the scriptures, but it doesn't. Even though I had become a Paedobaptist, I didn't feel like the explanations that were given of Paedobaptism were all that great in a lot of ways. Like the position overall made sense to me from the scriptures, but I do not feel like the explanations were all that great. And in reading Calvin and coming across his, and of course I saw this in Luther too, but I was especially drawn to Calvin, in reading his really strong language about the sacraments, what God does in baptism, what God does in the supper. It really sent me down a pathway to investigate those things further, because I wanted to figure out, is what Calvin's saying, is it really biblical? It sounds like the Bible, but is it really biblical? So what does it mean, biblically? And then B, why am I not hearing this kind of language used in the Reformed circles that I've been in? If anything, when I hear, a pastor talk before they baptize a baby, they spend a lot of time talking about what baptism does not do. And Calvin seems to do. So that kind of sent me down that pathway. And so in the late 90s, I had started to do some writing on. So this is a long story too. You asked about my call into the ministry. I'll give the really short version of that. I was actually on a pre-med track as an undergraduate, looking at med school, but I was also very involved in a Reformed campus ministry, and the campus pastor was actually leaving Auburn to go to Austin, Texas, to plant a church, and so basically before he left, it was right before my senior year of college, just as I'm starting to prep for the MCAT and that kind of thing. He said, med school will always be there. He said, I really want you to come work for the church I'm planting in Austin for a couple of years, because I think you'd be a great candidate for pastoral ministry. And this was a big, Reformed campus ministry on campus, several hundred students involved. And there were very few that he encouraged to pursue pastoral ministry. So when he did, when he told that to me, which was healthy, because the standard message was, look, you need to go be a teacher, or you need to go be a banker, or you need to go be a lawyer or a doctor, and you need to live out your vocation Christianly. And that kind of work matters to God. That was the typical message, which was great. That's what a lot of college students need to hear, because particularly in the South, you had then, and you still have today, this kind of view that, if you really want to make your life count, or if you're really serious about your faith, or if you really want to do something great for God, you have to be a pastor or an overseas missionary, you have to do some kind of church-related work. That's what counts. So the message typically was very much grounded in a reformational doctrine of vocation. So when he said that to me, it really caught my attention because I knew he was not just going around telling guys they needed to go work for a church.
Yeah.
So again, to make a really long story short, I ended up doing that. I ended up getting married right as I graduated college. Jenny and I moved out to Austin, Texas. She went to work for a classical Christian school. This was in 1995. So the classical Christian school movement was very young. But she went to work for a classical Christian school, and I went to work for a church plant, a PCA church plant in Austin, Texas. And that was just a great church situation. Our church grew very rapidly. Partly, I'd like to think partly because we did things really well as a church. I think we did. Also partly because Austin was very under-churched at the time, especially with Reformed churches. So we really filled a void that was there. And we had a really well-rounded church. But it allowed me a lot of time to study, a lot of teaching opportunities. I started to do some writing. And so just to give you an example, one of the first things that I wrote, and really the session had asked me to do this because of conversations I was having with them. We were doing communion once a month. We were using grape juice. I raised some questions about that. And next thing I knew, I'd written a paper on wine and weekly, why we needed to do the Lord's Supper every week, why we needed to use wine instead of grape juice. And we adopted those things, and then a number of, we kind of become, I want to say, a flagship church for the PCA, but definitely a prominent church because we had grown so rapidly in an urban area. And so a lot of other church plants and even established churches followed suit and began to implement weekly communion wine as well. I started to do some writing on baptism in the late 90s as well. So a lot of the things that became the Federal Vision or the Auburn Avenue controversy, those were things that I was already interested in, in the late 90s. So I got ordained, not ordained, but I got licensed I did eventually get ordained in the PCA, but I got licensed in the South Texas Presbytery in 1996. I took a Paedocommunion exception at that time, and it was completely non-controversial.
Interesting.
I had to answer a few questions about it, but it was not controversial at all. We had a man in the presbytery, so this was the kind of thing that made me think we really needed to do work in this area. We had a man in the presbytery who I never really got to know well, but I did appreciate this. When there would be a licensure exam or an ordination exam for a teaching elder, this man would always stand up, and he would have his book, his copy of the Westminster Standards open, so that was supposed to be a hint, I think. And he would stand up and he would ask the candidate a question. He would say, how do the sacraments become effectual means of salvation? And repeatedly, the candidates would stumble around and basically come out and say, well, they're not really effectual means of salvation. They're really more like signs and symbols. And that's the kind of answer that you would get very often. And then he would say, well, I just asked you a question out of the Westminster Short Catechism. And you're about to take an oath of loyalty. You're about to take an oath of loyalty to this document, swearing to uphold it. I suggest you learn a little bit more about what it does. But this is what struck me about that, is that the guys who gave the wrong answer to that question still always passed the exam.
Huh.
Yeah.
So you can completely contradict the Short Catechism on the sacrament. I mean, obviously built into that question is the view that the sacraments are effectual means of salvation, and then the answer explains how they are. And I think it's a good answer as far as it goes. But guys who basically completely denied that were still getting passed. But for me, it was a real eye-opener. And I thought, well, okay, so we really do need to do some work in this area just as a matter of confessional integrity. I had also gotten really interested. So I'll give one more little vignette of sort of my theological development, and then you guys can take this any direction you want to. There was a used there was a Christian bookstore I went to close to where I lived when I was a college student in Auburn, and they had a huge used book section. And that's usually where I would go buy my books because they were much cheaper, and honestly, they were usually better books. Like you could tell, you'd have somebody who would just offload a lot of Reformed books and that kind of thing. Well, one time I stumbled across a book called Through New Eyes.
Oh yeah.
And I pulled it off the shelf and I was like, this looks really interesting. This was the old white cover that had like sunglasses on the cover, and
I had a copy of that.
Yeah. So that was the early stuff, from like 1985, and I was like, this looks really interesting. So I took it home and I started reading it, and I was like, this is just bizarre. Like, this is just too weird. I have no idea what this is saying. And I put it down. But I came back to it about, 6 months later, and I thought, I'm just going to give this book another shot. Devoured it, loved it, got on every mailing list, ended up actually calling Jim Jordan and having some phone conversations with him. And so on the one hand, I was interested in theological retrieval, reading Luther and Calvin, recovering aspects of Reformed theology that seem to have been lost as we sort of dumbed down and popularized our own tradition. But on the other hand, Jim, and of course I started reading Peter and Peter Leithart's work, like The Kingdom and the Power was one that he had put out, right about that time that I read that was very helpful. Started reading their work, and so there was also this interest in, I would just call it cutting edge biblical theology, like really embracing biblical theology, learning to read the Bible as a story, which I think is very consistent with covenant theology, but a lot of covenant theologians I don't think grasp how we're supposed to see how the Bible fits together as a single narrative. And so certainly Jim's work really, really helped me with that. I started, of course, this is back in the days of cassette tapes. I got all kinds of Jim stuff on cassette tape and would just listen to it constantly. No matter what I was doing, I was listening to Jim. So I had a really, deep interest in those things. And when the church I worked at in Texas, I worked there for 7 years. And one aspect of my job was to stock the church library with different kinds of resources. And so when I left there, I think the entire Biblical Horizons catalog was in the church library. Now, I don't know what they did with it. I'm sure they don't have it yet. But the entire VH catalog as it existed at the time was in the church library. So.
Wow.
Nice. So this is something that I remember, like I've listened to lectures from, I would think, the early 2000s. Like I came to become aware of, some of these Reformed things back in 2006 and 2007. That's kind of when I started. And I remember listening to guys like yourself. There were some lectures, and I forget which conference it was at. You and several other guys talking about what you just mentioned about the Westminster Catechism on the sacraments. And you guys kept saying, but we're just repeating what the Westminster Divines said. So, when... Now, I don't know about now, but back when you were coming into the PCA and getting ordained, how did they handle the when you take an exception to that confession? Like, because you mentioned Paedocommunion, how did they handle that? Because I mean, on the one hand, you've got the guys that are like, well, I don't believe in what the thing says, and then they get a pass. And how does this work? Well,
so this is the conclusion that I eventually came to. Yeah, so I got ordained in the PCA. I was in 2 different PCA presbyteries, never really had a problem. But of course, all of that really predated the controversy.
Right.
Once things became controversial, and really, especially in the PCA and especially in the South, Paedocommunion was the most controversial aspect of the Federal Vision controversy. Certainly other things got attention, the particulars about justification by faith, the possibility of apostasy. There were certainly other things that got a lot of attention. But Paedocommunion was really the lightning rod issue. And I think it became the lightning rod issue really for 2 reasons. Partly because you had sort of a critical mass of guys who were taking a Paedocommunion exception, seeking ordination in the PCA. And I think if it was very, so long as Paedocommunion was very fringe and very few guys are taking this exception, there was no threat. But I think that there was this sense that I mean, especially guys coming out of Covenant Seminary. And I'm not a huge fan of some of the things that go on at Covenant Seminary today, but they have had in terms of their faculty, they've had a Paedocommunion presence. So there were guys who had come out of Covenant with a Paedocommunion position that they basically picked up from their professors, Jack Collins in particular. And so I think as that kind of hit a critical mass, there was a real fear or concern that, oh, wow, this could get where it actually does change things. So there was a big pushback.
So do you think that?
I think the other thing is well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking, Rich, do you think that was that was one of the reasons that became such a flashpoint with the Auburn Avenue conference? Is because there was this growing acceptance of Paedocommunion in the PCA, and folks were getting alarmed. Do you think maybe that was one of the drivers of the reaction?
I think so. It's interesting because Paedocommunion was not a major topic in that 2002
conference
it wasn't at Auburn Avenue. But you can definitely see, like, if you were to take what was taught at that conference about covenant and election and about the visible and invisible church, and so if you really take those things, you can see how the groundwork for Paedocommunion is really being laid. You know, whether all the speakers embrace it or not, whether everybody, you can see how the groundwork for this is being laid. So yeah, I think that was definitely part of it. I think the other thing that I came to recognize is that the PCA is very Baptistic. It's very revivalistic in its orientation. The PCA, as it grew, PCA started actually right here in Birmingham, but as it grew, it really absorbed a lot of people who were coming over from Baptist circles. I mean, that's a very common narrative, especially in the South, for somebody to grow up Baptist, they start reading some theology, they become Reformed, they jump into a PCA church. A lot of guys who would go off to seminary. That was kind of their. I mean, it was really kind of my background, really, quite honestly. But there are a lot of guys who did not really ditch the Baptist paradigm when they became Reformed. So they kind of brought it with them. So it would be, and of course, even in Southern Presbyterianism, historically speaking, like going back to James Henley Thornwell, Thornwell basically said, our baptized children are enemies of Christ until they have a conversion experience. And he didn't word it exactly that way, but that's more or less what he said. And so you have to have the conversion experience. Faith is got a strong intellectual or rationalistic component where you can actually articulate what it is you believe. And so, in the PCA, it was sort of like, I don't want to say infant baptism was sort of grafted on to the soteriology, but it was infant baptism was not well understood, and so infant baptism did not carry with it the implications that it should have in terms of how the child is viewed after being baptized and that kind of thing. I mean, where I live right now, I'm surrounded by PCA churches. Several of the largest PCA churches in the country are right here, and it's amazing how many people move over into these churches who are Baptist, and they basically stay Baptist. I mean, I had a conversation with one guy a while back, and I was like, and I kind of knew how he was going to answer this question, but he was on from a Baptist church in one of the big PCA churches here, and I said, so what kind of things had to change for you to make that change? Like, was it a hard transition at all? And he said, no, it wasn't hard at all. It just like it didn't really like it doesn't really. The fact that they baptize infants doesn't really make any difference, Right. He kind of saw that as an odd thing, but it didn't really challenge his Baptist way of thinking because it really was not a different way of thinking. The children were baptized with a future hope that someday they'll become Christians. And in a lot of PCA contexts, it's very clear that, the way it's put basically is the child becomes a member of the church, not at baptism, but when they meet with the elders to become communing members. They will obviously talk about communing and non-communing members, but that language ends up getting used a lot. This is when you joined the church, when you were 12 years old and you met with the elders and you professed faith and became a communing member. So, there were a lot of things like that. My experience in the PCA was one of the things that really, I had come to Paedocommunion convictions based on just, studying the scriptures. And it was one of those things that when I read Calvin dismisses Paedocommunion in about half a page without really engaging in any serious arguments. He acknowledges that Augustine was a Paedocommunionist. He acknowledges that the Anabaptists try to use this to, as a way of arguing against infant baptism. If you're going to baptize infants, you need to communion as well. I was convinced of Paedocommunion on biblical grounds. The arguments I had encountered against it were not impressive to me. But it was one of the things too that reinforced Paedocommunion to me was being in the PCA for several years and watching the process of baptized children become communion members and how arbitrary it was. Kind of like in Baptist churches, you might have a Baptist church where all the kids walk the aisle and get baptized at 8. And then across town, there's another Baptist church where all the kids walk the aisle and get baptized at age 12. And you're like, well, why does the Holy Spirit work at age 8 over here and age 12 over there? They're in the same zip code. Why this 4-year gap in the Spirit? And I saw the same thing with communion practices in the PCA. There was no consistency to it. Mm-hmm. Depending on which elders did your exam, you might have a child pass at 4 years old, or you might have a child at 8 years old who doesn't pass. Mm-hmm. Because the standards could vary so wildly in terms of what counts as a profession of faith and how much does the child really have to know. And so the whole process just seems very, very artificial. And it's like, you think about it, access to communion is a really big deal. Mm-hmm. Presbyterians are supposed to believe in the regulative principle of worship. So if nothing is taught in Scripture, there's nothing explicitly commanded about what it takes for an initiated child to have access to the feast. We're not given anything. How is that even possible? How can that even be? How can you end up with such a huge gap or omission? It's something that's so important. So there were a lot of things like that too that really confirmed my Paedocommunion conviction.
Okay. So, Rich,
one thing I'll say about it.
Go ahead.
Well, just one of the things. Something that I saw that forced the issue for a lot of people was when, if a church takes communion very infrequently, then the question rarely comes up.
Right. Yes.
Or if a church dismisses children for children's church, the question rarely comes up. But if you combine with, for example, the church I was in Texas, this is sort of how we did it. If you combine weekly communion with keeping children in the worship service, the Paedocommunion question becomes it becomes a very existential question very quickly. Yeah. So my son at, I don't know if he was the youngest communing member in the PCA at the time, but I think he had to be one of the youngest. But when he was 2.5 years old, I had him meet with the elders and answer some basic questions I had taught him, and they accepted him as a communing member at 2.5. And that meant going up front and taking membership vows in front of the whole congregation. Oh, yeah. Which, thankfully was a pretty large group of people he did that with one Sunday. And I remember my wife and I, discussing this, and we're like, well, should he take his blanket with him up front or not? Actually, he's great. He answered all the questions, he did. I mean, he loved it. So, he thought it was fun to be up there. So, but I knew, but we had kids in the church who were twice as old, who were 5 years old, who met with different elders and did not get accepted to the table.
Right.
And because I was on staff, I knew which elders to ask to come do the examination. I knew which ones would be most sympathetic. But, so I don't want to take the whole time talking about that issue, but it is certainly one that's at the heart of the federal vision controversy and my own work.
Well, one thing I noticed, because I've got a number of children as well, and we went for a vacation one time down into southern BC, and we went to a Presbyterian church on Sunday because that was the only Reformed church I could find in that town. And I remember we got to the end of the service and they didn't have communion. And I grew up in a Mennonite church where that's pretty common, but my children had never seen this. So the sermon finishes, we sing the last hymn, and then everybody just stands up and walks out and starts milling around at the coffee machine in the back. And the look of palpable confusion on the faces of my daughters was just magnificent.
Yeah.
They were like, "Where's the supper, Daddy? You brought us to a pagan A pagan worship service. Like, I thought it was really funny. I'm like, not every tradition does things the way we do, darlings.
Yeah. Well, one of the most striking things for me was I was in the United Reformed Church until my daughter was 3 years old, and then we came over to Grand Prairie, which is a CREC like yours. And my daughter was allowed to participate in the Lord's Supper the first Sunday we got out here. And I just remember the expression on her face when she realized that she was allowed to take the bread and the wine. She was like, really? Me? I'm allowed? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think I had probably come to Paedocommunion convictions. It was quite a while back, probably 2000, maybe even before. But I'd never been in a place that practiced it. And so it was kind of at arm's length. We went one time and visited. It was probably 2003. I think we visited Gary Vanderveen's church down in Langley. And they were doing Paedocommunion. And I had a 6-year-old son at that time, Jonathan. He lived in his own world, and rarely did we get a glimpse in there, or it seemed that way. But communion came around, and Jonathan's playing on the floor, and the plate came by, and I said, "Johnny, you can take here." And his eyes got wide, and he said, "Really?" And he fist bumps way up in the air. Goes, yeah! And I'm thinking, oh, goodness, what am I doing? Yeah. We've got to start practicing this.
Yeah. Well,
so you, Rich, pastor a CREC church now. How long has that been the case?
So I have been here in Birmingham for about 20 years, just over 20 years. And the church had been in the PCA previously. This was a small congregation, kind of a fledgling congregation that had been without a pastor for a number of years. In the year before they called me, they had actually had a congregational vote a couple of times about whether or not just to completely disband. It was a small and struggling church.
Okay.
And they were in the PCA. They called me to be their pastor, trying to give it sort of one last shot, and try to make things work. And the PCA presbytery here blocked my transfer. So I had been in the PCA for a number of years. I'd been ordained in the PCA, and most of the time, transfers from one presbytery to another are really just a formality. But this was 2004. This is right at the height of the federal vision controversy, and they were just not going to let a paedocommunionist in, somebody associated with the federal vision. They never gave an official reason why they denied my transfer. I did meet with the examination committee, the candidates and credentials committee. I'll just say extensively. It was a several-hour meeting. Most of that discussion was taken up with discussing paedocommunion, paedobaptism, status of covenant children, paedofaith, all of those things. One of the more prominent members on that examination committee said to me at one point, he said, "Now, how does this fit with the age of accountability?" I said, "Well, what age of accountability?"
Yeah.
And they were very hung up on how can you say that the sacraments have efficacy for unbelievers. And I said, well, I don't think of covenant children as unbelievers. And I pointed to Psalm 22.
Right.
And at one point, the same man that asked that question about the age of accountability said, "It seems like you've just got one verse." like you keep coming back to this one verse. I was like, well, I mean, it's one more verse than you have, the age of accountability. But after this, there are other verses. I didn't say that in the exam. That's what I was thinking. But it's true. I mean, it does. There is more biblical support for instant faith than there is for an age of accountability. That same man also said, he said, I know my children were not regenerate when they were young.
Oh, really?
Which, of course, the fact that children are somehow used as proof that they're not regenerate. So there were a number of things like that where I could tell, we're just coming at this from very different places.
Right.
And so they basically, that committee basically, they denied my transfer. Now, they did say, the elders of the church that had called me here in Birmingham, they were sitting in on that meeting. They were not allowed to speak during the examination, but they were witnesses to it. And when we got done with that examination, they did ask for basically an official statement, an official reason why my transfer was being denied. And the committee basically said, the chair of the committee said, we're not going to do that. We can't give you a reason.
Oh, wow.
They did not want to put anything in writing, I'm sure. And they did say, look, if you want to go forward to the presbytery without the recommendation of this committee, I mean, you certainly can do that. Which, of course, they were not interested in that because that was going to be a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
But so that meeting ends. I'm getting in my car to drive back to Louisiana at that point, and the elder said, hey, do you have time just to go grab dinner and sit down? We'll talk about this a little bit more. And so when we sat down for dinner, they said, look, we think what happened was a travesty. We think you'd be a really good fit. We don't think they had good answers or counter arguments for your position. We thought you answered the questions well. We would be right at home with everything that you said. If we went back to the congregation and we agreed to leave the PCA and find another more suitable reform denomination, and we reissued a call to you, would you still come?
Interesting.
And I said, yeah, I'd be very interested. I'd be very interested in that. And so basically that's what happened. They withdrew from the PCA, and I would say they did so very peaceably. I mean, there was no animosity. It's just a recognition of just differences. Sometimes Christians of goodwill differ on things, and you go different directions, and that's just how it is. And that was really how I looked at it. So I withdrew from the PCA. The church withdrew from the PCA. I moved here, and then we began our transition into the Series C not long after that. We looked at some other options, but really I already had a lot of friends in the Series C by that point. I had a number of relationships with men in the Series C, and so it was just a very natural direction for us to move. So,
right.
So that's what we did.
Okay.
So,
good. So we do book recommendations at the start of our podcast, and before we called you, I had recommended Paedofaith by you. I looked at the date in here; it was 2005, so it was right around in that time when you were talking about coming out of the PCA, and around that conversation when this book came. Was that one of the generators that made this book a necessity?
It is, yeah. So the book was a product of that failed attempt at a transfer within the PCA. So I had already done some work on this question, but I had not really thought about a book on it, even though I had looked into the question of, do infants have faith? Luther answers that question in the affirmative. Calvin talks about a seed of faith in infancy that will later grow to fruition, but the seed of faith is a form of faith for Calvin. Mm-hmm. There were some Puritans that make reference to this, Augustine. So I was very familiar with things that have been taught about this throughout the history of the church, but there was very little actually written on it in book form. Very little, there just wasn't really like an extended treatment of it.
Yeah, I don't know of any other.
I had some initial. Yeah, so I had some initial conversations with the PCA Presbytery Committee here in Birmingham, and I could tell even before I met with them in person that infant faith was going to be a big issue. So I wrote an 8-page paper on Paedofaith, and I sent it off actually to Jack Collins at Covenant Seminary, and I didn't tell him why I'd written it. I just said, Jack, tell me what you think about this. And he wrote back and he said, yeah, he said, this looks good. He said, this is, pretty much what I teach. I think this looks good. And then I said, hey, Jack, I'm trying to transfer from one PCA presbytery to another. I know this is going to be the most controversial aspect of my belief when I am examined by them. I said, do you mind if I share with them your endorsement of what I've written here? Just so they can see that I'm not a crazy person. I'm not a total outlier. Like I'm not the only one that thinks along these lines. And he was very gracious about it. He said, oh yeah, he said, the PCA is a strange place sometimes. He said, that's fine if you want to share that. So I sent all that on to the chairman of the committee, because we had been in communication about a number of things, because they knew obviously that my transfer was going to would be controversial. I don't think it made any dent. I don't even know if they knew who Jack Collins was. Why that would matter, but it didn't really make a dent in their in how they viewed me. But after the whole thing happened, I basically turned that 8-page paper into the book Paedocommunion.
Okay.
So it really grew out of that. So I had written the paper initially because of that transfer, and then when it was done, and I'm leaving, Monroe, Louisiana, where Steve Wilkins is, and Athanasius Press has already started, and I don't even remember exactly how it happened, but Steve and I talked about it, as I was leaving Monroe, and I was like, yeah, I would definitely love to write a book on this and have Athanasius publish it, and because there's not anything else out there that deals with this topic, I think it would definitely fill a void. You don't want to write something that's just just basically something that other people have already written. It's
right.
Just saying the same thing. So I felt like it was an important work that could fill a void.
Yeah, it really does fill a void. I still can't think of any other people who have written on this. Maybe there are some that have written since, but this was the first time I ran across it, was reading your book back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think the only book that really touches on it would be Tim Gallant's Feed My Lambs, but he's talking more about the communion end of things.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are two good books to go together.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So you're in Birmingham right now. Is that the same Birmingham of the Theopolis?
It is, yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so you're closely connected to the Theopolis Institute then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Peter moved here from Moscow, Idaho in, I think it was 2013.
Right.
And set up what was initially Trinity House, and then that eventually morphed into Theopolis. And so Birmingham is the hub. So, and we planted a church with Peter, I guess it's been about a year and a half ago now. So we've really got kind of in the Metro Birmingham area, we've got 3 Series 2 churches.
Oh wow!
So now there's probably 35 PCA churches. We got a long ways to go to catch up.
Right.
We've made a start.
Yeah,
we are the tithe.
So I'm wondering, could I take a bit of a shift in the conversation? I'm thinking. Especially, I follow you on X, and I would say that your account on X is one of the most interesting accounts there. And you've been talking a little bit about Christian nation. So I was wondering if you could give us like a bit of a breakdown of what your thoughts are on Christian nationalism and ecclesiocentrism.
Yeah. Well, so Christian political philosophy, Christian political theology is something that has interested me for a long time as well. Going back into the early 90s, I got interested in what the theonomists and Reconstructionists were writing. I never embraced all of that, and I thought that I mentioned Jim Jordan already. His book Through New Eyes, and then eventually some talks that he gave called A Theocratic Critique of Theonomy. That was really, really helpful to me as I was sort of working some of these things out. But I went to graduate school at the University of Studies Philosophy, and part of that was doing some work in political philosophy. And so I've been interested in these questions for a really long time: biblical law, natural law. How have Christians historically developed their outlook on the purpose of civil government, all of those kinds of things. And of course, all that ties in with a number of other biblical themes and texts that have to be exegeted and all that. So I've been interested in questions for a long time. I'm not an expert by any means, but I've had an interest for a long time. I do think it's interesting. I think if you go back to the Reformation, you have with, let's just call for the sake of the argument Calvin's position, the classical two kingdom position. Okay, Calvin was very much a believer in Christendom, in the Christian organization of society. Christ is Lord over all. The state should recognize his lordship. You should have a Christian church and a Christian state dwelling together, mutually cooperating, all of that, serving the advancement of the kingdom of God. All that's there. You could say the social, cultural, and political conditions that undergirded Calvin's political theology eventually broke down with the rise of the Enlightenment, the rise of a secular form of rationalism.
Yeah.
Some of this uses the religious wars that happened in the wake of the Reformation as kind of an excuse for privatizing religion and enthroning reason in the public square. You have Christians who then try to grapple with these changes and basically, I would say, adapt Calvin's political theology to these changing conditions. So an example of this would be Abraham Kuyper. I think Kuyperianism is an attempt to apply Calvin's political theology, which was developed in one set of conditions, to now apply that in a different set of conditions.
Interesting.
And Kuyper, I think, has some deep flaws. Paedocommunion, obviously, I think had some good criticisms to make of Kuyper, but that's what it was an attempt to do. Kuyperianism is an attempt to adapt Calvinism to changing cultural and political conditions. I think Reconstructionism was really the same thing, an attempt to bring, I'd say, not just Calvin, but the Puritans' political theology into the present and adapt it to a new set of conditions, cultural and political and economic conditions. And I think the Christian nationalist movement that's happening right now is the same kind of thing. The Christian nationalist movement, just like all these previous movements, is very diverse. Many different things are sort of going under that banner of Christian nationalism. But I think and in some cases, it's an attempt to basically re-Christianate the past. In other cases, it's an attempt to, I think, adapt and improvise the theology of the past for, again, a new set of conditions. But I think all of these are attempts to basically apply a Calvinistic or Reformational political theology to a very different situation than the one in which the Reformers live. And so I'm very much on board with that as a general project. Now, that doesn't mean that I think everything that goes under that banner of Christian nationalism right now is good or the direction we should go. But it's definitely a good conversation to have, and I'm glad to see a lot of Christians get interested in political theology.
Yeah.
Because I think this has been a glaring lack in our discipleship. You have so many churches that for so long would not talk about anything political, or if they did, the only thing they would talk about was the issue of abortion.
Yeah.
But we really have not taught our people how to live and function as Christian citizens and what that really means.
Yeah.
And so I think to give renewed interest to this I think that's a step in the right direction. We just need to figure out what that is. So I think that's a good thing overall. Even if there are a lot of things that I think still need to be worked out, and a lot of rather sharp disagreements that I think also need to be obviously going to have to be resolved for this movement to ever really get very much traction. Now, you also asked about ecclesiocentrism. I do consider myself an ecclesiocentrist, but I keep seeing people use that language in ways that have nothing to do with what I believe or what a lot of others who I think would use the term believe.
Okay, give us yours. Give us yours.
Well, okay, so the Reconstructionist movement, just like the Christian Nationalist movement kind of split as soon as it began, the Christian Reconstructionist movement had kind of already been through this back in the 1980s and into the 1990s, where it kind of split between those who really thought the family was the basic unit of society and it's most important to get the family, worked out, and that's how cultural change is going to come. And then those who, like Jim Jordan, who basically said, yes, the family is important, but there's a kind of centrality to the church that Scripture teaches that we need to recognize. And so this doctrine of ecclesiocentrism arose, and I think it's one that's clearly grounded in the teaching of Scripture. I think it's a doctrine that is not that hard to see in the Bible. Even Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Well, what's that talking about? Those who bless Jesus are blessed. Those who curse Jesus are cursed. He's the son of Abraham, the seed of Abraham. That's true. But all who are in union with Jesus are the seed of Abraham. So really what Genesis 12 is saying in New Covenant terms is those who bless the church are blessed and those who curse the church are cursed.
Yes.
How God deals with a nation or a ruler or a people group hinges on how they treat the church, how they treat the people of God. That's an ecclesiocentric view of history right there.
Yes.
Jesus, I think, is doing the same thing when he talks about the church as a city set upon a hill, a light that shines into the darkness. He talks about his people as salt, and if the salt loses its saltiness, that's when things go corrupt. So in a way, he's giving to his people a responsibility for the state of earthly civilization. The heavenly city has responsibility for the earthly city. If we shine like light, that drives out the darkness. If we lose our saltiness, things are going to go bad. The society is going to rot and it's going to be corrupted. So I'm actually teaching through Judges right now in a Bible study. We're getting to the end of Judges, and what you see at the end of Judges, those stories at the end of Judges are not just an appendix. From Judges 17 to 21. So you're done with the 12 judges now. Samson's the last of the judges. These stories are out of chronological order. They take us back to early in this time period, and they're given to us to explain what went wrong and why Israel continues to fall into idolatry and slide into apostasy. And what you find is at the end of Judges, there is no king in Israel, so everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Well, actually, in Judges chapter 8, Gideon said, hey, they want Gideon to be king. He says, no, you've got Yahweh as your king. Like, that's the key to the book right there. Yahweh is your king. But who represents Yahweh's kingship and who teaches them about Yahweh's kingship is supposed to be the priest. And in those final chapters, from Judges 17 through 21, what you see is the reason things have gone wrong in Israel is because their priests have been unfaithful. As the priests, so the people.
It's interesting that you would
everything
say that.
hinges around the faithfulness of the church.
Yeah. It's interesting that you would say that in Judges, because this is something that I've noticed there too. In that last story with the near annihilation of the tribe of Benjamin, who's the high priest? Who's named? It's Phinehas. This is the same Phinehas that was involved with the incident of Baal Peor.
Numbers 25.
In Numbers 25.
Yeah, the one with the spear.
Yeah. So he begins his priestly ministry in an act of violent expiation, and he finishes his ministry.
But faithful.
Yeah, faithful. And then at the end, he's got something very similar, but contrasting in many ways. And I find that very, very interesting, that a man can start well, end badly, or that, the entire, like you said, the entire cycle of Israel driving into apostasy is almost pictured in this one man's life. Like, if I were him, I would be
I would totally
disappointed in myself.
Well, it's interesting because that's true of Phinehas. And then the other priest, so the priest in chapters 17 and 18 is the grandson of Moses.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you can see the apostasy that has happened over generations or even within a generation. And you can also see that it's driven by the unfaithfulness of the priest. Mm-hmm. So really what I think that tells you is when the church is unfaithful, God's going to judge the nation, and the nation will fall into decline. And I think the flip side of that is that when the church is faithful, when God is being faithfully worshipped, then God, over time, will cause that nation, that civilization, to thrive and to flourish. Another way you can get at this is, so Abraham is promised the land, but he's also told that he will not actually take possession of the land until the sin of the Canaanites has reached its full measure. But he does get to go on basically a tour through the land. Mm-hmm. And everywhere he goes in the land, what does he do? He sets up altars and digs wells. He sets up places of worship. And so the liturgical conquest of the land is what will pave the way for the military and cultural conquest of the land that is to come. Liturgical conquest comes forth. The tip of the spear, so to speak, is liturgy. Liturgy is not the only thing we need, and I think sometimes this is a mistake that ecclesiocentrists could make, is to say, well, we can just stay in our prayer closet and in our sanctuaries, and we can change the world that way. No, you really do have to go out there and do something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what you go out and do in the world to activate cultural change has got to be grounded in the liturgy. It's got to be grounded in prayer. It's got to flow out of the worship service. The rivers of living water don't flow out of the Capitol building or the schoolhouse or the family hearth. The rivers of living water flow out of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you really want to bring change, that's where it doesn't end there, but that's where it's got to start.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Right. So if you're, if you, Christian, are looking for the most effective way of changing the world for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom, what should you do? You should get rooted in a church, in a faithful Christian church. Get rooted, and from there, operate from there. Right? That
right.
seems to be the the call.
Right. I actually I've tweeted something like this several times and written on some. But basically, the whole idea of "Make America Great Again," we could debate that the fittingness of that slogan, But I will say this: no country can be great without great churches.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can't have great families without great churches. You can't have a great culture without great churches. Mm-hmm. So, and that's not because the church is going to do everything, but it's because, like, the fact that Abraham built wells did not mean that Joshua didn't have to fight.
Right.
Okay. I mean, Abraham builds the altars, Joshua fights. You got to have both, but the one lays the foundation for the other. And I think I think a lot of American Christians have not understood that. And so we've tried to change the world mainly by direct action. And so, but the problem with that is that everything we do, Satan or unbelievers, they can counteract that. We make a move, they can counter move, and so you never really get anywhere because you're just using the same weapons, the same tools. And, you don't have any special weapon that they can't, answer with something comparable. But if you understand that all of this starts with the liturgy, now we've got a weapon that they can't counteract.
Yeah.
There are no countermeasures the world can use against prayer, against preaching, against the kind of things that God has called us to do as the church. And so I really do believe that cultural change flows out of the church. And I think what you're seeing in our culture, I think even the good things that are happening are happening because God's people have been faithful, and we have been, praying, and God is. I mean, I don't think that Trump is the answer to all that is wrong with our culture, but I think he's much better than the alternative would have been.
Yep.
And I would like to think that the prayers of God's people had a lot to do with Trump getting elected.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things I've noticed up here in Canada is like our political class is made up of a bunch of madmen who they can't tell light from dark, up from down, or man from woman. And some of them have suddenly started speaking sensibly in the last week.
Yeah.
And it blows my mind.
Yeah, even Pierre Poilievre can now tell the difference between a man and a woman.
Yeah, like our most conservative national politician couldn't do that last week, but he can this week. So, like, I'm just looking at, I'm just looking at this, just like, wow, the emperor had no clothing, and people are finally agreeing with me. But it's another good example, a recent example of what you're talking about with the prayer of the church being socially effective. Like I think back to the reversal of Roe v. Wade in America. I mean, there's been churches praying about this, begging God to do something since 1973. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, after all this time, you get a
win.
A win, but how many years was it?
49, right?
It was 49 years.
Yeah.
I could not help but notice. Yeah. So that I think is one of these marvelous examples of what you're talking about. Churches, and many churches from multiple denominations and different traditions were and have been praying about this thing. And the fight, like you said, it's not done, right? There's more to do. There's a lot more to do. Right. There's still babies being murdered upon the altar of Molech, but there is still work to do. But look at what happened. Look at what the Lord did do. And he did it in response to the prayers of his assembled congregation.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. There are all kinds of other things that were done too, all kinds of what you might call forms of political activism that were done. Mm-hmm. But I think those people today, like in the Christian nationalist movement, it's common to talk about political will. We have to have the will to do this. Okay. Well, where does that will come from? Mm-hmm. Where do people get the strength of will to stand against evil in its various manifestations? Well, God gives that. And God gives that in response to the prayers of the people. So, we need to be praying for courage for ourselves and courage on the part of our leaders who want to do what's right. We need to be praying for wisdom. I mean, again, where does wisdom come from? You've got to have wisdom to rule well. One of the things that Jim Jordan once said, which I thought was really perceptive, is if God is angry with a people, even if they elect someone godly to be their ruler, God will make that ruler do dumb things to punish the people through him. So, and there's plenty of historical examples of this. David, in 2 Samuel is an example of this, because, God makes David do something dumb because he's angry with the people. So it's not enough to just elect the right people. We really do have to be repentant. We really do have to be crying out to the Lord. We really do have to be building altars, worshiping God faithfully. And cultural change is going to flow out of that. The ultimate determiner of history is God, not politics. Mm-hmm. And God will often give people a wicked ruler as punishment for their sin, or he will give them a righteous ruler to bless them in their pursuit of righteousness. But you can't. And this is why another thing I've noticed with Christian nationalism is a big debate over whether or not there are political solutions to the problems we face. It's like, well, there are political solutions to political problems. That is true.
Right.
But the reality is, our deepest problems are not political.
Yes.
And we really have to go deeper than the political if we really want to fix things. Because again, even if you could get the person you wanted elected and get the laws you want passed, if God's angry with you, none of that's going to matter.
Yeah.
The real issue here is not, did we elect a Democrat or a Republican? The real issue here is God pleased with us, or is God angry with us? That's the real issue.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How much longer do you got?
Let's see. I can go about another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay.
Perfect.
You guys want to keep running for a bit?
Of course.
Okay.
Right. I was Birmingham on the Alabama map is up about 2/3 of the way up the state, something like that. How far is that from the Gulf of America?
We are about 4 hour drive to the Gulf of America. I was really hoping they would call it the Gulf of Dick.
Of Dixie.
But I guess we'll just have to go Gulf of America.
Yeah, okay.
That's funny.
All right.
So, when, one of the things that I really love, like Tim Gallant, a good friend of mine and ours, he got me started on Biblical Horizons material when I first came to town here, and I was really excited to see a bunch of this stuff moved over to the Theopolis website and whatnot. So when you've got a ministry like that in the same town as your church, how like that just sounds really exciting to me and really cool. How is that having such an important thing like that in the milieu of your church community? Like we don't have anything like that up here. And I just.
Yeah. Well, so, the Theopolis tagline is Bible, liturgy, culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that would have been a suitable tagline, for this church, as I thought to pastor this church, from when I first got here. And I think the great strength of Theopolis, of Biblical Horizons before that is, this straightforward Bible teaching, biblical exegesis. Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the church today is we simply don't. We've got. It's certainly true for the layman, but it's true of so many pastors. We don't really know how to read the Bible.
Yeah,
we don't really know how to teach the Bible, and so there's a huge gap there, and I think that Theopolis is doing a wonderful job of filling it. I think that if you are looking for really good commentary material, the material that Jim or Lightheart has put out is outstanding.
Yeah.
It's consistently so helpful. It is a reading of the Bible that is sensitive to the literary features of the text, which are kind of lost on modern readers because we don't write. The books that we write in the modern world don't typically have a deep architecture to them in the same kind of way that ancient literature did.
We don't write in chiasms.
The Bible. Exactly. Yeah. Or if we do, it's very unintentional. We don't pay much attention to it. But the understanding the literary structures like chiasms and things like that are of immense value in understanding the Scripture. Understanding typology. And that typology is not just about Christ, but about totus Christus, about the whole Christ, head and body, which, of course, was Augustine's great insight in his book on Christian doctrine. But that's something that I think that the Theopolis guys do really, really well is reading the Bible as a narrative about Christ and his church. And understanding typology and how typology works is absolutely critical to that. You cannot read the Bible as a book about Christ without understanding how to do typology. And so some people do typology in a very sort of superficial or artificial kind of way, and it's not very compelling.
Yeah.
But, Jim and Peter, others kind of
they're just masters at that job.
Really, absolutely, just masters at it. And so there's so much there to glean from. So yeah, I mean, they do really great work, and really thankful to have them nearby. So, it's an impressive set of resources they put together, and they do. So Theopolis does seminars and courses, obviously here in Birmingham, but also they take it on the road, and they'll go do a regional course, somewhere else. They'll go to Dallas or wherever, and go do a course for a local church in another area where obviously, you can try to promote that in your community and get people to come. So, and they've also added a music component, which I think is really good, with Jonathan Ahern, where they're doing a lot to cultivate higher quality music in churches. So that's obviously super helpful as well. Music is another area where the modern church is just in such bad shape.
Yeah.
The whole contemporary Christian music scene is just so, the music that's put out so often is very effeminate. The lyrics do not have any theological depth. It's obviously the way many churches conduct their worship service. It's all carried on by a praise band. It's basically worship by proxy. I mean, this is one of the most interesting things to me about what we've done is, like, if you think about the Reformation, one of the things the Reformation was about was restoring the priesthood of all believers. And part of what that meant is that when you gather for worship, you worship.
Yeah.
You are part of offering a living, the living sacrifice that is offered to the Lord in gathered worship is corporate. In medieval times, you would basically go to watch, listen to a bunch of monks sing in a language you didn't understand, and then a priest mumble some words that you don't understand, but you would go there to watch, basically. You went as a spectator. You would watch.
All the important stuff goes on up on the stage.
It all goes up on stage, and you would go to watch the miracle of the bread being converted into body and wine being converted into blood. And that is just a spectacle that you would take in, but you didn't participate in it. And the Reformers said, no, the people are the priesthood. The people corporately must offer a sacrifice. Well, you go to a lot of modern evangelical churches today, and we're right back to where we were in the medieval period. You go to watch. Now, they're singing, which you can't understand, but the praise band up front, it's like a concert, and you're there to take it in, not participate in it, but watch it. And so you're kind of put in this very passive position as a worshiper. There's no liturgy to participate in. There are no responsive readings. There are no corporate prayers.
I'm watching that worship leader worship and trying to imitate it in my chair. Right, I don't even know that everybody, but you're definitely a spectator, and if you are trying to imitate it, it's still a form of worship by proxy, really. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a fascinating connection. I've grown up evangelical in the evangelical world, and how it has turned into something that is recognizably medieval Roman Catholic. In its ways of presenting worship. It's astonishing.
Yeah, and with the infrequency of the sacrament in evangelical worship, it's basically back to the one half of the Eucharist for the congregation.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
right.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, right?
Yeah. So liturgy is definitely an area where the church needs reform, and I think in Theopolis, in the Series C, we're seeking to bring these reforms. And obviously, there's churches outside that have good worship outside of our circles, but this is a major problem in American, I'll just say American evangelical circles, because that's what I'm most familiar with, and so that's something obviously we'd really like to see change. And but in order to do that, you've got to teach people a theology of worship, a theology of liturgy. You've got to show them that the sacrifices, the sacrificial order that God gave to his people in Leviticus is still in effect. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not offering animals anymore, but the sacrificial pattern is still the pattern of worship.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things there that are really, I think, really crucial to recover. It really comes back to where we started this conversation, which is with the ordinary means of grace. That God is really at work through the preaching of his word and the administration of his sacrament. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of what you see in the modern evangelical church is, well, word and sacrament's not enough. We've got to somehow make this exciting and entertaining and engaging to the man on the street if we really want to win people to the gospel. And I understand that desire. I want to see people won to the gospel as well. But I think that word and sacrament, I think the presence of Jesus in the preaching of his word and the presence of Jesus in his sacrament is more than enough to win the loss.
Yeah.
Jesus will do it. We just need to be faithful with what he's entrusted to us.
Yeah.
And you're going to win people to the gospel, not with a TED talk, but by opening the scriptures and pointing to Christ.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is excellent. I'd like to say thank you for taking this time to talk with us today. I think this is really excellent.
Yeah, great talk to you guys. Yeah.
So, are there any places online, such as social media, or any writings that you do that you could maybe tell us about, so that our listeners could go check all those things out?
Yeah, sure. So, one way to track what I'm thinking any given moment is on X. So, I really just got active on X back in maybe the summer and fall. I waited many, many years to get active on social media, partly because I've always thought social media was just a disaster, and I still think that. Partly because when I was raising my kids, I wanted to minimize my kids' involvement with social media, and it didn't make sense to try to keep them off of it if I was super engaged with it myself. But my kids are grown now. That's no longer an issue. Honestly, I think that my deciding to get involved in X was sort of an experiment to see whether or not I thought it would make any difference. I'm still running that experiment, I suppose. I don't know that I've reached any conclusions. But I do think, we kind of alluded to this, I do think there's been something of a vibe shift. And I think Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and making it a free speech platform, basically providing assurance that it would be sort of a public square where ideas can be.
It rescued the public square.
Yeah, I thought, at some point it hit me. I was like, if Elon spent all this money on it, the least I can do is use it. I can't do good on there, and I don't know if I really have or not, but I have dabbled in that a little bit. So people can find me at Vicar 1973. So at Vicar 1973. Probably if you search my name, I'll pop up that way too, because I've got my name on there. I'm not an anonymous account. But at Vicar 1973. Our church website, we've really got two websites. So we've got our main church website, which is Trinity. It's TrinityPresBham.com. So TrinityPresBham.com, and that's got sermons and Sunday school classes and all that kind of thing. And then if you go to tccpastorsPage.com, that has got a lot of my writings, a lot of my conference audio, Bible studies I've done, just various things like that. I've got a blog on there. I don't blog a whole lot, but I do occasionally put something on there. So those would be ways to connect with me. Of course, I've written or contributed to several books. Paedocommunion is probably the one that I'm best known for, but I've actually been a contributor to a number of different books. Yuri Brito and I have done a couple of commentaries together on Ruth and Jonah. My most recent book that I've done myself is called Measures of the Mission, which is sort of my, everything but the kitchen sink book. It just kind of covers a whole range of things. The church, Christian vocation. There's even a little bit of political theology thrown in there. There's some biblical theology in there. Talk about creation a little bit. Talk about men, women, and marriage, and parenting a little bit. So it's really it's a book that I wrote to sort of be an introduction. Really, the way the book came about is we had a guy who came and joined our church. He came from another denomination, and he kept getting the question, "Why did you leave our church and go to Trinity Pres?" And after answering that question so many times, he finally said, I wish we just had a book. I wish there was just a book I could think about. And so anytime I would say something in a sermon where he was like, "Oh, that's why I'm here," he would make a note of it.
Oh.
And he came to me after a while and he said, people keep asking me this question, why I came to your church. And he said, I've kind of made I've kind of taken these notes over the last several years of different things that you've said that I was like, that is why I'm here. And he's like, I think these things need to be turned into a book. And so that's what we did.
So he handed you your outline.
That's awesome.
He basically did. Yeah, exactly. He said, these are the key things. Like, these are the things that I knew I needed to hear and that I think other people do too. So that's Measures of the Mission. That's an Athanasius Press book. I contributed to The Glory of Kings, which was a festschrift for Jim Jordan. I contributed to a festschrift for Norman Shepherd as well. I'm drawing a blank on what that one was called, but I did an article on, I think it was called Obedient Faith. We did a book called Obedient Faith, which was in honor of Norman Shepherd, and then we did another one entitled A Faith That Is Never Alone. I've got two essays in that one. A Faith That Is Never Alone was kind of an answer to some of the critics of the federal vision. So I would say if somebody's looking for, like, what is the federal vision about? I would not necessarily say to start in 2002. I would say look at some later things that came out where, you know, there's been discussion and criticism and all of that, and I think you'll get more mature voices. So I would say something like A Faith That Is Never Alone was edited by Andrew Sandlin. My essays in that book, I've got two that are basically on justification. I would say those are good things to look at if somebody wants to, explore that. The article that I wrote for the Norman Shepherd Thestrip, Obedient Faith, it's a historical article on the Reformed doctrine of justification by works. And basically, it's an examination of how, in the Reformed tradition, we've always believed in a final judgment according to works, where the outcome is either justification or condemnation. We've always had this doctrine of a second justification that's fallen by the wayside, and that's unfortunate. You know, that's the law. So those are some of the things I've written. I did a book with Randy Booth called Church Friendly Family, that were just kind of the distillation of some conference talks we gave together. I did a catechism years ago called I Belong to God, which I think is also good. If somebody's just looking for an introduction, it's like, what would federal vision theology look like if it's in catechetical form for children? That book, I Belong to God, is kind of my stab at that. I'd like to go back and revise that at some point. But anyway, those are some things I've written. I've done a bunch of online essays. I used to write for the old Theologia website. All of that Theologia content has now been moved to Theopolis. So all the stuff I did on baptism and other topics in the late 90s, early 2000s, that's all there. So, and I've got a couple book projects I hope to get to in 2025. So we'll see what happens.
Awesome.
All right.
Most excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. It's been a delight to have this conversation with you. We hope that your day is a great day today, and the Lord be with you.
Mm-hmm. The Lord be with you as well.
And thank you for joining us. Bye.
Yeah, thank you all.
We are the Chinook Podcast. Nathan Zeckveld, Brad Donovan, Jamie Souls, and we're delighted to have brought you this conversation with Rich Lusk, pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, a CREC pastor there. He's written lots of things. He's affected us a great deal, and so it was a delight for us to be able to have a conversation with him. Mm-hmm. We want to be of value, of blessing to you folks, and we hope this conversation served to do that.
All right. Well, you all have a good day. All right. Bye.